Chapter 10. Mr. Peterson? Mr. Peterson, look at me. That's it. Just take slow, even breaths. Breathe with me. Come on, let's count together. 1, 2, 3, 4. Kate crouched in front of Bill Peterson the next night in the reading nook of Lizzie and Fitz, her eyes keenly focused on the octogenarian seated in front of her as he wheezed and gasped and his lips turned blue. "Why'd you have to rile him up like that, Audrey?" one of the ladies chastised loudly. "You're all right, Bill. Just breathe, for heaven's sake." "He's such a drama queen," said Audrey Josipovich dismissively. "Paige?" Kate slanted her eyes over towards Paige, who was standing by the edge of the couch, fretting. Paige leaned over and braced her hands on her thighs to listen. "Would you please call EMS for Mr. Peterson?" "Right." Paige straightened up and went to the old soda fountain counter, leaning across it to grab the phone. "I don't need no The old man's words were lost in a fit of rheumy coughing as he struggled to catch his breath. "Don't talk, Mr. Peterson. Just calm yourself and take some more deep breaths for me, okay?" Kate kept her voice calm and steady, even though her heart was thudding in her chest and a rising panic threatened to overwhelm her. "Never mind anyone else. Just keep your eyes on me, and we'll do this together. 1, deep breath, that's it. 2, I knew it wasn't a good idea to let a former Arthur in," Mrs. Heath chimed in from somewhere. "You said we were a modern club," protested Mrs. Josipovich. "It was your idea, Irene. Don't you try to deny it now." "They're coming," Paige announced, coming back to the sofa with a glass of water that sloshed a little as she moved. "EMS will be here any minute. Are you doing okay, Mr. Peterson?" All this fuss," he finally managed, his jaw wobbling as much with indignation as with adrenaline, Kate guessed. Nonsense, all of it. Bunch of silly... He let loose with a resounding cough that sounded like wet fabric being torn. "Silly women." "You started it," Mrs. Josipovich admonished, to tuts of agreement from most of the other ladies gathered around. "If you got all hot under her collar, it's your own damn fault." "Mrs. Josipovich," Kate said patiently, "please, let's just settle down and let Mr. Peterson catch his breath. I think everyone just got a little overexcited, but we need to calm down. This is just a friendly little book club. No one needs to get upset." Paige had warned her that any commingling of the Agathas and the Arthurs could get ugly, but Kate wouldn't have believed just how ugly if she hadn't seen it herself. The evening had started off pleasantly enough. Kate had picked Luna up as promised, and they'd arrived to find all 6 female members of the Agatha Christie Appreciation Society already in the reading nook, chatting happily around the cozy fire. Gentle jazz music from the 1930s played in the background as Paige served up a new hazelnut coffee blend, and the ladies withdrew floral notebooks and well-worn copies of Poirot's Adventures from their capacious handbags, ready to discuss their favorite subject. Kate had been delighted to see Luna so eagerly greeted and welcomed into the group, and was amazed at how she looked even smaller, even more frail, in amongst the more robust and Rubenesque younger seniors around her. With a little prompting from Kate, Luna had told them of her long-ago chance meeting with Mrs. Christie in England, to which all the ladies listened with open mouths and bright eyes, tittering about what an absolute honor that must have been, and how fortunate they were to have a near celebrity in their midst. Luna's soft cheeks had glowed pink with delight. She'd brushed away their praise with a wave of her hand, but Kate had seen the flush of genuine girlish pride in her eyes. When Bill Peterson had arrived around 9, he'd seemed like a sweet, quiet older gentleman, given to wearing high-waisted gabardine slacks, a button-down plaid shirt faded from many, many launderings, and a gray wool cardigan that seemed far too heavy for a summer night. He'd greeted everyone warmly, turning twinkling blue eyes on the host of ladies sitting before him, and had settled in amongst them with jokes about how this book group was a far sight prettier than his last book club, and smelled nicer, too. He was a widower, Mrs. Hatch said by way of introduction. Kate had often noted that once people reached a certain age, their marital status seemed to be the most important fact to know about a new acquaintance. And he had been with the Arthur Conan Doyle group for about a year. He told them he had decided to leave over creative differences, whatever that meant, and, maybe more importantly, the fact that the diner where they usually met had started insisting on a 2-coffee minimum from each of the members, if they were going to keep taking up 3 full booths all night. So that had been the end of that. And so the meeting had commenced, the topic of discussion being Hercule Poirot and the genius of Mrs. Christie. They were talking about Murder on the Orient Express and what a brilliant plot she had concocted, helped in no small part by her most famous detective, the effete little Belgian with the funny moustache, using his little grisettes to unravel the carefully concealed truths of all the suspects. Poirot was a master at observation, someone had said. It didn't even matter who. That's all it had taken to start the fireworks. Mr. Peterson had started to fidget in his seat, and then, as the ladies all chimed in about Mrs. Christie's genius in having Poirot know enough of that nonsensical Russian alphabet with the wacky letters to notice that the initials H-N weren't really H and N in English, but rather stood for the letters N and L in Russian. And wasn't that clever of Mr. Poirot to spot that monogram on a handkerchief and put it all together and, well, Mr. Peterson had had quite enough. Sherlock Holmes was the master of observation. There could be no debate on the matter. Conan Doyle had beaten Christie to it by several decades and had produced a far smarter, far more inventive, far more impressive detective. Well, before anyone knew it, in between the shouts and the outraged gasps, the arguments and counter-arguments, the accusations of misogyny and, possibly worse, "Did you see action in Belgium during WW2? Is that why you don't like Poirot?" Mr. Peterson had ripped Mrs. Josipovich's copy of Murder on the Orient Express from her hands and flung it across the room in a blaze of righteous fury. As the book hit the wall and fluttered to the floor, a hush fell over the group, which is when everyone noticed Mr. Peterson had begun to wheeze. Enjoying the lively spectacle up to that point, Kate's stomach had dropped when she saw just how distressed the old man actually looked. Trembling, his hands pressed against his chest as if to hold in his thumping heart, his lips tinged with a bluish hue, he looked like he might pass out any moment. Without wanting a return to the chaos of the moment before, Kate had simply knelt in front of him, gently taking his hand in hers to feel the pulse in his wrist, and tried to calm him down. "Do you take any medication for your heart?" she asked now, noticing that even though his breathing had slowed a little, he still looked shaken. His pulse was thready and far too fast, which made her suspect he took nitro or some other medication for a heart ailment. "Maybe nitro spray I can help you with?" He shook his head violently, as if the mere suggestion were another assault on common sense, like the Poirot statement had been. "Okay. May I just undo the top button of your shirt here?" she asked, aware that her tone sounded like a mother talking to a recalcitrant child, "just to make it a little easier to breathe." "You show me a tougher, more complex case than the dancing man." He shot a fierce glance at Mrs. Josipovich. "Conan Doyle was a genius, an absolute genius." "Genius?" Mrs. Josipovich snorted. "Conan Doyle thought a ghost named Phineas was giving him career advice." "Enough, you two," Paige demanded. She smiled indulgently, as though the subject wasn't, at this moment, threatening to kill one of her customers. "Let's just agree to disagree, and let Mr. Peterson have some air." Kate deftly undid the top 2 buttons of Mr. Peterson's shirt, noticing the splotches of red on his chest and neck. Where is that ambulance? He needed oxygen, at the very least. She remembered that from the mandatory first aid training she'd been in charge of every year at work, and judging by the sheen of sweat on his forehead, he needed a lot more than just oxygen. "Can you ladies please move? I think we need to get Mr. Peterson lying down." Kate's voice was firm enough that the ladies moved without protest and stood, watching in blinking silence as she gently guided him onto his back. "They warned me about this crowd. They said I'd regret coming over here." Mr. Peterson said, and then began coughing again until Kate helped him into a semi-sitting position, and his breathing improved. I should have listened. You all have your heads up your— Have a drink, Mr. Peterson, please. Kate cut him off. You need to calm down. He dutifully sipped from the glass, and Kate was relieved to see the color beginning to return to the edges of his lips. He took a few more gulps and then turned to look at Kate, as if noticing her for the first time. Thank you, young lady. What was your name again? Half dead and still making eyes at the girls, someone said, and the laughter that bubbled up seemed to ease the tension a bit. Kate smiled at him. I'm Kate. Are you feeling a little better? She slipped her fingers beneath his wrist and felt for his pulse, which had settled down to a steadier rhythm. Thanks to you, I am. That one over there, though. He tilted his chin over towards Mrs. Josipovich, who stood with her arms crossed over her ample bosom and scowled. She's trying to kill me. Mrs. Josipovich snuffled like an offended bird and began to protest, but at that moment the bell jangled as the front door opened, and in strode Noah Kincaid, all decked out in his dark blue uniform with a bright orange medic bag slung over one shoulder. Now it was time for Kate's heart to start skipping a beat or two. Hello, ladies, can I ask you to make some room, please? Noah said briskly, his eyes focused on Mr. Peterson. The ladies fled like frightened pigeons, and someone pushed back the sofa a bit so Noah could come kneel beside Kate in front of the patient. Noah's partner Emma came in the door then, pushing a wheeled stretcher in front of her, and Kate started to move out of the way so Emma could take her place. Noah held up his hand to stop her as he deftly unwound a stethoscope from his neck and put the ends in his ears. How are you doing tonight, sir? Noah asked in a loud, almost convivial voice. He sounded so different. Professionally conversational, if that were even a thing. Emphasis on the professional. Kate sat back on her haunches, waiting for further instruction, feeling a little hot chill of pleasure at the commanding but gentle sound of Noah's voice. I'm fine, said Mr. Peterson, struggling to push himself into an upright position on shaky arms. Hold up now, Noah said, sliding the flat disc of the stethoscope beneath the man's shirt and pressing it firmly to his white undershirt. After a few seconds, he glanced up at Emma and said quickly, Ready? Emma nodded and wrote something down on a clipboard. Kate watched, mesmerized at this esoteric communication between the two of them. Noah then looked down at the large military-style watch on his left wrist, still pressing the stethoscope to the man's chest. What's your name, sir? He asked casually, as though he were giving the old guy a haircut. Peterson, the old man said. Bill Peterson. Can you tell me what happened here, Mr. Peterson? Better not, said Paige, wrinkling up her nose. Noah looked up at his sister in surprise, but instead of questioning her further, he turned to Kate instead. Do you know what happened here? Kate swallowed and moistened her dry lips. It's a book club night. We were having a discussion about Agatha Christie. Mr. Peterson got a little worked up. I did not get worked up. She provoked me. Peterson's watery blue eyes grew vivid with new outrage as he pointed towards Mrs. Josipovich. Okay, Noah said, smoothly removing the stethoscope. Without glancing up at Emma, he recited, VTAC 150 BPM sinus. Give me 15 masked, please. Emma wrote this down and started removing a large bottle of oxygen from where it lay on the stretcher. I didn't do anything to him, Mrs. Josipovich put in. And you know what day it is, Mr. Peterson? Noah asked as he wrapped a large black cuff around the man's thin arm and velcroed it tight around him. Emma was behind Mr. Peterson then, fitting a clear face mask over his nose and mouth with a small inflated plastic bag just below it. Of course I do. It's Thursday, said Mr. Peterson, his voice muffled by the mask. Then he looked a little uncertain, and for a moment even Kate couldn't remember what day it was. Mr. Peterson's expression cleared. Thursday, yes. And one last question. Do you know where we are right now? The bookshop, Mr. Peterson answered. Why are you asking me all these fool questions? Noah nodded at Emma, who scribbled something down again. We're just checking you out, Mr. Peterson. Just being thorough. Noah started squeezing the bulb end of the blood pressure cuff he'd just applied. The hissing of the cuff as it inflated was the only sound in the room, besides the odd pop and crackle of the fire. Noah slipped the disc of the stethoscope beneath the bottom edge of the cuff, and then, with a slight motion of his fingers, began to release the pressure from the cuff. The air hissed out, and Noah watched the red needle on the dial start to fall back down until it reached the 170 mark and began to jump, falling in staccato pulses down towards 0. After another few seconds, the rest of the pressure whooshed out of the cuff, and Noah removed the ears of his stethoscope. 170, 130, he called out to Emma. Brachial? Emma asked, not looking up from her quick writing. Brachial, resp 16 shallow regular. Okay, Mr. Peterson, are you on any medication for your blood pressure, maybe nitroglycerin? She already asked me that, Mr. Peterson answered churlishly, his mask steaming up as he spoke. Noah frowned and looked up at Emma, who shook her head with a "beats me" look on her face. Not her, the old man said, and waved a hand towards Kate. This one. She asked me if I had nitro spray. Noah glanced over at Kate. It was just a brief glance, since he was in go mode and seemed to be an altogether different person than he usually was, but the look in his eyes made her flush right down to her toes. He was impressed with her. She couldn't remember the last time someone had been visibly impressed with her. My doctor gave me a bottle of stuff and I never use it. Never had the need before I came here. I want to have a little look at what your heart's up to. Is that okay? Noah asked, and no one present could have possibly thought he was really going to wait for an answer. Need to hook you up to a machine in the truck. Let's just get you up here on this comfy bed and get you out there. I'm not going to the hospital, Mr. Peterson announced. Oh, come on. They have really pretty nurses there, Noah teased him. Pretty nurses? Kate felt a stab of jealousy. Completely inappropriate jealousy, of course, considering what was happening in front of her, but jealousy all the same. Did he really think that? Or was he just saying that for Mr. Peterson's sake? Hospitals are for sick people, Mr. Peterson said, his voice sounding like a cheese grater had run over his vocal cords. I'm not sick, I'm pissed off. Noah laughed, along with a few of the ladies, and that smile, oh God, that smile of his was going to be the end of Kate. Especially kneeling down like that, one knee higher than the other, serving as a bit of a platform for him to fold up his blood pressure cuff, focused on his work, looking unbelievably gorgeous in that dark blue uniform that clung to his body in all the right places. Let's just make sure, Noah said, his tone changing slightly. More kindergarten teacher than medic. He straightened up in one fluid movement and helped Emma angle the stretcher into the nook and alongside the couch. This time Kate did move out of the way and stood by the armrest awkwardly, not quite knowing what to do with her hands. With a quick and practiced movement, Noah released a lever on the stretcher and it collapsed down to a position almost level with the couch. He undid a couple of straps, unfolded a crisp white sheet, and reached for Mr. Peterson's arm to help him shift himself onto the mattress. I don't need no stretcher, Mr. Peterson complained. I can walk just fine. I know you can, but we have to use these things, just like when they make you use a wheelchair leaving the hospital. It's a rule, sorry. Kate met Noah's eyes and knew immediately it wasn't any kind of rule. She smiled at him, but bit her lip to try to limit the smile from taking over her face. He smiled back at her before turning his attention to Mr. Peterson, scooching his gabardine-clad butt onto the stretcher with a groan. Damn fool wasted time and money when I don't need to go to the hospital. It's just a precaution, Noah said, almost by rote, as if he'd recited this script 1,000,000 times, just to be safe, okay? Will he be all right? Mrs. Josipovich asked sternly, only a tinge of worry in her voice. We've got the oxygen on and his vitals look good, Noah answered noncommittally. We'll let the doctors take a look. Okay, now, Mr. Peterson, just lie back. I'll tilt the end up here for you. He fiddled with another lever and brought the pillow end of the stretcher up to a semi-sitting angle. Is that better, sitting up like that? Yep, she did that too. Kate looked down at her shoes. She didn't think she'd survive another look of unabashed admiration from Noah, not without throwing herself at him right then and there, in his cute little uniform and everything. Well, I see you've been in excellent hands, said Noah, and when Kate managed to look up and catch his eyes again, he winked at her. Oh, God, not the wink. I can survive anything but the wink. Noah and Emma secured Mr. Peterson with the black straps and tucked the oxygen canister neatly between his feet before rolling the whole unit back out towards their waiting ambulance. They left with the gravitas and ceremony of a train leaving Grand Central Station, and all the ladies clustered around the doorway to see the patient off. On the way out the door, Noah spotted Luna and waved, his smile brightening up his face and hers. "Good to see you, Miss Travers. Pleasure to meet you, ladies," Noah said. And then, just as he backed out the door, his eyes found Kate's, and he tipped his fingers to his temple in a mock salute. "Good job, Malone." She tried to speak, but her voice came out in a squeak. "Thanks." Kate, Paige, and the Agathas watched as Emma and Noah bundled the stretcher into the back of the ambulance, all of them commenting in the hushed voices of the awestruck about how efficient Noah was, how professional they were, and all that gibberish they were spewing out. Didn't he sound just like George Clooney on ER, only for real? As the ambulance pulled away with its blue lights flashing, but no siren to pierce the quietness of the street, Kate remained at the window to watch it trundle down towards the local hospital a few miles away. Early the next morning, way too early, if she were being honest, Kate stood outside Noah's apartment. She hadn't been able to sleep properly since the events of last night. She'd tossed and turned, invaded by images of Noah in his uniform, his strong biceps almost bursting out of his sleeves, his muscular thighs flexing as he kneeled in front of his patient, his jovial but professional treatment of the old man. He was so good at what he did. So efficient, but casual, as if dealing with a potentially life-threatening situation was no big deal. After a few fitful hours, she waited till 7 when she knew Paige would be up, and phoned her to say she was worried about Mr. Peterson, which she was, and could she have Noah's number? Paige said Noah never answered his phone at the end of a night shift, in case it was someone wanting to pull a double, but she'd given Kate his address and said to just drop over. And so here she was. Just dropping over. She drew in a deep breath and knocked. Silence. Clearing her throat, she knocked again. "Noah? It's me, Kate." Nothing. She should just go, she thought. She could always do this another time. It was the end of a 12-hour shift for him. He was probably already asleep, and besides, he wouldn't want company. The door opened with a forceful gust of air, as if it had been yanked open. There in the doorway, naked but for a towel around his waist, dripping wet and gorgeous, stood Noah. Oh, good God. "Kate," he said, blinking, like she was the last person he expected to see on his doorstep. He smiled, uncertainly, and then his expression softened into genuine delight. "Hi." "Hi," she said. She tried to stay focused on his face and not on the bare, tanned, glistening expanse of male chest in front of her, or the towel. I'm sorry if this is a bad time. Paige said you don't answer your phone, so..." No worries, I just got home," he said, standing back and opening the door wider. "I just don't usually have guests at this time of the morning. I didn't know who it could be." He paused and then said with a touch of something more meaningful in his tone, "I'm glad it's you." She smiled, knowing her smile was turning down at the corners like it often did when she was embarrassed or felt awkward, which was most of the time, and certainly right now. Come in, he said, stepping aside even further and beckoning her inside. "I can put some coffee on." "Oh, no," she said quickly, stepping into his sparsely furnished living room. "I know you need to get to sleep. I don't want to keep you up. I just came over to ask about Mr. Peterson. I've been worried about him. Is he okay?" Noah closed the door with a quiet click and turned to face her. He ran his hands through his wet hair, and she watched, fascinated, as water droplets trailed down his neck and onto his broad shoulders. He had filled out so much since his teenage years. This sculpted specimen of a man was nothing like the tall, lanky boy he had been. Working ambulance for so many years had kept him in excellent shape, but this was way beyond the call of duty. She knew she was embarrassing herself by staring at him, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. "Yeah, Mr. Peterson," he blew out a sigh. "Well, I'm not really supposed to talk about patients, but, oh, God, I should have thought of that," she cringed. "I'm sorry, forget it, forget I asked. No, it's okay, he smiled and reached for her hand. His hand was a little wet and a little cold, but just the touch of his fingers brushing against hers made her shiver. She looked up into his eyes as he stepped closer and smiled down at her. He asked me to give you a message. Oh? She asked, feeling his closeness, feeling the heat of his body practically turning the water to steam. He asked me to thank you for taking such good care of him. He said you were very soothing and comforting. Aw. She shied away from the compliment. I just tried to reassure him. He said you saved his life. A laugh escaped her lips, and it brought a gorgeous smile to his, which made her laugh even more. I did not. You know I didn't. He shrugged. Who can say? Maybe your touch has healing powers. He was just overexcited. I know the feeling. Flushing, she looked down at their entwined fingers and tried to steady her racing heart. As she did, she caught a glimpse of something along his torso, a long, jagged white scar etched into his skin just above his bottom rib. He followed her eyes and looked down at himself. Oh, sorry, it's gross, I know. He moved to shield himself with his arm, but she stopped him, gently pushing his arm aside so she could see. It's not gross, don't be ridiculous, she said. She let go of his hand and traced her fingers over the thickened ridge of the scar. Paige told me you got injured on the job when you worked in the city. Is this what happened? Yeah, he said, still turning away slightly to hide. It's no big deal. We were just dealing with a psych patient and my partner hadn't patted him down first. He had a knife up his sleeve. Kate frowned. What? You mean somebody stabbed you? Yeah. Well, it was more like a slash than a stab. Nicked my spleen, but it could have been a lot worse. Oh my God, Noah. I thought you'd been, injured, like a fall or something. I had no idea it was something like this. I'm so sorry. He brushed it off. It's okay. I was pretty lucky. I wouldn't call this luck exactly, but I'm glad you're okay. She looked at him again and saw that glow of affection and wonder in his eyes that made her insides melt. He held her gaze for a few seconds longer, and then the moment was gone, chased away by a bashful look of self-consciousness that made him look like that boyish, lanky teenager again. Just give me a minute, put some clothes on, I'll be right back, he said, stepping away from her before she could tell him not to bother. She'd be leaving. Somehow, the words just wouldn't come. She was far too occupied watching that gloriously broad, naked back sauntering away from her and disappearing into another room. She blew out a sigh and folded her arms across her chest, rubbing her upper arms like she was freezing. She was anything but freezing. She could feel that tug of desire, that lulling, seductive awareness of him flowing through her like a warm wave. It was a strange sensation. She'd seen him completely naked the other day, leaping into the freezing lake like a maniac, and she hadn't felt nearly the same kind of electric, breathless warmth she felt now at the mere sight of him, toweled and fresh from the shower. She should go. She knew she should go. Mr. Peterson was all right, and so now she could go. It had been nuts coming over here. No one needed to get to sleep. Maybe if she just called out airily that she had to get going, she'd see him. He emerged from the other room, wearing a pair of gray sweats and pulling a black t-shirt down over his splendid abs. He smiled as he came towards her, his eyebrows raised in a question. Coffee? I could use a cup. No, thanks. I was going to say that you needn't have changed. I should be going. I don't want to keep you from sleep. I need to decompress a bit after a shift, he said, his voice low and gentle, soothing in a way that excited her all the same. Come on, come sit down with me for a minute before you go. There was something Mr. Peterson wanted me to give you, too. She took a seat on the couch, awkwardly at first, and then sat back further against the cushions as she sank deeper into the comforting softness. Noah took a seat beside her, closer than she would have expected, his thigh brushing up against hers in that accidental but not accidental way. A little buzz of arousal swept through her, pleasant and warm. That hot chill again. Can I just say, what a fantastic job you did with him, Noah began, shaking his head slightly as though he were witnessing something astounding. Taking charge of the situation, calling for us, asking about the nitro. I was in charge of our first aid training at work, she said, warming at the compliments, but as usual, uncomfortable accepting them. I remember some of the things you're supposed to ask, that's all. Well, you did great. So much of the time bystanders are a hindrance, but you... He paused and let his eyes drift over her face for a moment before returning to her eyes. You were perfect. I just wanted you to know that, and to thank you for what you did. You calmed him down and did everything right. And he's going to be okay? She asked. Noah nodded. He's fine. They're keeping him in overnight for observation just to be safe, and the doc's going to insist on some blood pressure meds, but he's fine. He just can't ever come back to a meeting at the Agathas. Kate smiled ruefully. Noah laughed gently. From the sounds of it, no. Well, I have to say you were the real showstopper tonight, she said, surprised at the tone of admiration that colored her words, but not regretting it. You were so professional, so calm and cool, and you handled everything so smoothly and made it all look so effortless. I can see why you love your job. It's an incredible thing you do for people. I really admire you for it. His lips quirked, and he looked down, a bashful boy again for a moment, but an achingly adorable one. When he looked back up, there was a sparkle in his eye that hadn't been there before. Thank you for saying that. It means a lot to me. I'm not just saying it, I mean it, she said, putting her hand on his thigh for emphasis, and then realized how intimate and poignant a gesture it was. She softened her voice a little. This wasn't even that serious an emergency. I can't imagine the skill and knowledge and judgment you have to use in really awful cases. You're just amazing. Something flickered in his eyes, and he smiled bashfully again, this time flushing noticeably even in the dim morning light. He looked down and put his hand over hers on his thigh, gently outlining her fingers with his own. He didn't look up at her when he spoke. I thought you considered me a bit of a grunt. Never. Or I should say, not serious enough. He looked up. Not good enough, you know. She could have protested at length, but they had been over this at the cabin already. A simple declaration, emphatically stated, was the better way to go. You are more than good enough, she said. You always have been. Then why don't you... He started to say, as though the words had been on the edge of escape for days, and he had to snap them off before too many got loose. He sighed and his eyes drifted as he tried to find the right words. He found her eyes again. Why are you on that dating site? Why won't you go out with me? The vulnerability in his question made her heart surge, and she wanted nothing more than to take him in her arms and make him forget he'd ever thought he wasn't good enough for her. But she held back, like she knew she had to. I think you're attracted to me, he went on cautiously. Aren't you? I mean, it's okay if you're not. I just thought, based on the way you've kissed me back the last few times, Clearly I'm attracted to you, Noah, she said. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. Look at me, I'm shaking like a leaf here. He started a bit at her words, and she could feel the slight uptick of tension in his body. His thigh muscle tensed, just that little bit. And if her newfound paramedic skills were any judge, his breathing had hitched a little too, and speeded up. Well, he said, after a long moment. She was relieved to see some of that playfulness return to his expression. Well, that's a relief. It'll make giving you Mr. Peterson's message a little easier. Oh? Kate asked, and her heart began to beat a little crazily. Judging by the way his large, dark eyes were taking her in, she thought she had a pretty good idea what that something might be. His exact words were, give her a kiss for me. "Oh, well, how sweet of him," she said, her stomach fluttering like a trapped moth. "Yes, very sweet," he murmured. He stretched his arm along the back of the couch behind her and leaned closer to her, the scent of shampoo and soap and him almost as alluring as the small smile teasing his lips. "May I deliver the gift?" "I suppose it would be rude not to." "Oh, very," he smiled, and leaned down to brush his lips lightly against hers. She expected a full-blown kiss, a long, lingering, sensual pleasure bomb that was the hallmark of a Noah Kincaid kiss. But instead, he let his lips linger for just a moment and then drew back, the feeling of him still stinging her lips. He smiled and laughed softly when he looked at her. She knew she must be looking at him with a dazed kind of bewilderment. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yes," she managed. She cleared her throat. "Yes, that was lovely. Thank you." "Thank him," he corrected. "That was a kiss from him. This one's from me." He lowered his mouth to hers and kissed her. And this time, it was exactly the kind of kiss she had come to expect from him. The best damn kisser she'd ever known. He angled his head to one side as his mouth moved over hers, as his warm, soft lips met hers and jolts of pleasure lit her up inside. He groaned softly, which made her want to do the same, the pleasure and sweetness and pure heat of the kiss spiking through her as his tongue teased her, gently, softly, with intoxicating sensuality. His hand curved around her and slid down her back, and he leaned into the kiss as if his need to kiss her was growing stronger and deeper and more overpowering by the second. She could almost taste his desire in the warm depths of his mouth, as his tongue tangled with hers, as his lips moved in a slow, sumptuous rhythm of tasting and savoring, almost like he was enjoying the sweetness of a lush summer peach. And as she kissed him back, as she closed her eyes and melted into the kiss, allowing every sensation to starburst behind her eyes and send tingles of pleasure down to her very core, she felt, somehow, strangely, that this kiss was different than the others had been. This kiss was more real, if her lust-addled brain could see through the haze of pleasure well enough to evaluate it. This kiss wasn't a performance, which is how she now thought of the others, as mind-blowing as they had been. They had been powerful and possessive and thought out. This kiss was raw and real, built on genuine need and spontaneous desire, and was so much the better for it. He breathed against her jaggedly, small sounds of pleasure thrumming through him, and she breathed against him, her own breath fast and shallow, and without even knowing she was doing it, she was reaching for the bottom of his shirt to get rid of the damn thing and feel that wonderful male skin again, those strong, sculpted muscles. He groaned at her groping hands, spurred on by her taking the lead, and as she fumbled with his shirt, he leaned her back onto the sofa, laying her down beneath him as he angled his head first one way and then the other, claiming her mouth over and over again, deepening the kiss one moment, shortening it to a quick nip or nibble the next. He was enjoying her. She could feel it through every murmur of pleasure at her touch, every groan that rumbled through him as she kissed him back. Breathless, he broke the kiss and moved to her neck, trailing his lips along her, kissing, nipping, licking and tasting, his breath hot and ragged next to her ear. She turned her head to the side and clutched his back, reveling in the scorching trail his lips were leaving along the column of her neck. "God, Katie May," he breathed. I want you so badly." He nuzzled her neck, moved back down along her jaw, caught her eyes and pinned her with a look of wild desire so fierce it took her breath away. And in that same moment, that very same heady moment of lust and the sweet agony of arousal, a memory sliced into her mind. A certain night, on a couch like this, lying beneath a man like this, hearing words and sounds and expressions of need, just like this. God, no, not again, please, God, not again. An MFA, remember? He must have seen the sudden flare of dismay in her eyes, because his own expression changed immediately, and a frown shadowed his face. He pulled back, his eyes moving quickly over her face, worry etching lines into his forehead. "Are you okay?" he asked. "What's wrong? What did I do?" "Nothing," she swallowed, gently pushing him back to indicate she wanted to sit up. He moved off her and further down the couch so she could sit up. "I'm sorry, I just can't." "Okay," he said quickly. "No problem. I'm sorry if I went too far. Really." His face fell. "I feel like such a shit." "No, don't," she said, smiling ruefully at him. "It's not you. It's me. God, that sounds so cliche, doesn't it? But it's true." Still, he moved even further down the couch so they were no longer touching, and he looked completely shaken, as though he'd just forced himself on her. Her heart went out to him, and she sat forward, tucking her feet beneath her and leaning towards him to put a hand on his chest. "You are incredible, Noah. You make me feel things I've never felt before with anyone." Hope bloomed on his face and sparked in his eyes, easing the furrow in his brow. He put his hand over hers on his chest and rubbed his thumb across her fingers in a gesture so intimate, so sweet, she felt like she might just start to cry. On impulse, she leaned forward and kissed him, lightly at first, a sweet, tender, gentle kiss. A kiss that he didn't respond to at first, but which, within a few seconds, seemed to melt him as much as it did her. She felt him soften beneath her mouth and then begin to kiss her back, his lips parting beneath hers, his tongue meeting hers, accepting her, welcoming her, sliding back into that gorgeous heat without missing a beat. He didn't move to lay her down again, or try to take her in his arms. He simply kept stroking her hand as she rested it over his heart, and kissed her passionately, sweetly, breaking the kiss every few moments to look into her eyes, mutely questioning, waiting to know if this was what she wanted, looking for permission to surrender to the sweetness and the heat again. God help her, she couldn't say no. His mouth was too luscious, his kiss too sensual and warm and velvety soft, the pounding of his heart beneath her hand too expressive for mere words. But she had to say no. She had to say something. As he moved from her mouth to the sensitive flesh at her collarbone, as he trailed his lips over her shoulder and neck, nuzzling her again with tentative slowness, with careful but lingering kisses, she felt her resolve failing, felt her desire for him beginning to capsize her. If she didn't stop him right this minute, "I'm getting married," someone blurted out breathlessly. Someone who sounded a lot like her.